So good evening and welcome to everyone. I'm John Shattuck. I'm the president and rector of CEU for those of you who are visitors here. And welcome to all the students who are joining this evening's panel. It's a very exciting opening public event for a whole week of an extremely important exploration, and I think that's probably the right word to use here, of strategies for developing means of overcoming what has become known as the resource curse, as we all know. I'm just going to say a very few words of introduction and then turn the panel over to our expert moderator, who I'll introduce in just a moment, and then sit in the front row and be able to absorb much of what's going to be said here this evening. So I think the theme of the panel discussion this evening challenges us to come up with answers to what one of our speakers calls, he calls it the $1 billion question. I think I'll call it the multi-billion-dollar question. And that is, how can East Africa stop losing so much revenue? And of course, that's a question that could be applied in many other settings as well, as I'm sure the panel will be exploring. We certainly know that oil and gas revenues have been discovered in East Africa, and that this could transform or should transform the economies in the region and the countries in the region and the welfare of the citizens of the region. But we also know that similar resources discovered in other poor regions often haven't led to investments, in infrastructure or in social services, and that increased revenue often hasn't produced development or the alleviation of poverty and inequality and all of the challenges that face not only East Africa but many other parts of the world. So one answer, and I'm only going to pose the answer and then listen to what the panel has to say about it, one answer to the multi-billion-dollar question is transparency. We all know that the transparency, the concept of transparency, the very word transparency has a very broad appeal, but it's an appeal because it seems to be such a benign term. We know that corporations and governments are often willing to endorse this concept, at least until it gets to the point of talking about the real issues, which will be the topic of this panel, no doubt, and that is the way in which the resources that are exploited in terms of those discoveries that have been made in East Africa and other places, those resources are allowed to become the benefits for the citizens of the region in which the resources are discovered, which seems almost self-evident, but that's where the controversies no doubt begin. And that's certainly the starting point of tonight's panel, which will assess the role of transparency and other strategies in addressing the resource curse. We have a stellar group here on the CEU platform. Dr. Danny Kaufman will moderate the panel. As you all know, Dr. Kaufman is an innovator and a global leader on resource governance and development. He's the president of the Revenue Watch Institute and a member of the World Economic Forum faculty in Davos. Also, I don't know whether I'm going necessarily in exactly the right order, but I think let me introduce now Prosper Ngawi, who lectures on economics at Mzumbe University in Tanzania and is a prolific writer and commentator specializing in East Africa's oil and gas sector. Charles Wanguhu is a social activist with a strong governance and human rights background. He's the current coordinator of the Kenya Civil Society Platform on Oil and Gas. And finally, to my immediate left is Dr. Ricardo Suarez de Oliveira, who lectures on comparative and African politics at Oxford University and has worked in the field of energy governance for the World Bank, the European Commission, the National Democratic Institution, and many other places. So let me also, of course, extend a very warm welcome on behalf of all of CEU to all the participants in this wonderful 2-week intensive professional training course, development course that has been organized by the School of Public Policy. I know our participants come from, I think, some 22 countries, I was told, if I'm not mistaken, Bernard, wherever you are. But thank you for being participants in this, coming to CEU and having us be able to host you at this. I also want to give a special thanks to the Revenue Watch Institute and the Natural Resource Charter for having established a strong partnership with CEU in this very, very crucial and cutting-edge field of public policy. So with this, Danny Kaufman, I turn the discussion of the evening over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is to thank John Shattuck, the director and the president of CEU, for hosting us, and again, for the collaboration with you, which is already has been going for well over a year in this very ambitious undertaking. We already had a great first day of interaction with many of the participants who are here, and there are other guests. In addition, I understand that we are kind of online and on Twitter, and we may get questions with Twitter, so it's very important to be transparent and full disclosure. Anything that is said here is on the record. Thanks, John, also for introducing the panelists, including Ricardo, who just arrived at the nick of time from other parts of Europe, Prosper and Charles. We are fortunate to have you here. We know about the major challenges as well as opportunities in natural resource governance. We started this morning by indicating and suggesting something that has been said before by others, including Paul Collier, that governing better, improving the management of natural resources is probably the development challenge of the generation. For Africa alone, it's not just a $1 billion question or multi in the small sense. We saw this morning, even in the case of oil alone, is a $400 billion question a year, as opposed to all of overseas aid from official development agencies that goes to sub-Saharan Africa, which is only $50 billion. So we're talking about a much larger challenge in terms of the domestic resources, how to harness them, and how to use them in the most effective manner for development. And with that, we have great expertise here representing academia and civil society. And we will start, in fact, because you have just arrived, Ricardo, with you. Then we'll go to you, Charles, and then to Prosper. We have been interacting already, very lively discussion during the course that started earlier this morning. So without further ado, we'll start with Ricardo. We know about the scholarly approach and books you have written, including on the issues of challenges and natural resource management on West Africa. So with that in mind, maybe you can tell us your initial reflections of what are the main challenges in West African countries. The rules of the game are that each panelist are going to have 3-4 minutes for an initial introductory comment or feedback to a question I will pose. Then we'll have some more interaction or back and forth, and then we'll start opening it to both the audience and there may be questions by Twitter. So, Ricardo.
Thank you, Danny. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I've spent most of the last 15 years in West and Central Africa looking very much at these questions. And I think the experience in particular of the last decade is very relevant to make sense of what's happening in East Africa. And I'll explain why that is so. Just to give you a couple of examples, the GDP of Nigeria in 2002 was $59 billion. In 2012, it was $243 billion. The GDP of Angola in 2002 was about $12 billion. In 2012, it was $114 billion. Just these sets of numbers tell you about what's happened in not the new oil producers, but just the seasoned oil producers who benefited, in some cases, from an increase in production, but mostly from the global increase in the oil price. And looking at the trajectory of these states over the last decade makes the challenges that we're looking at in East Africa and elsewhere even more challenging. The reason for that is that over the last 10 years, you've had a massive increase in revenues. You've had a significant increase in capacity, but that capacity has mostly been felonious capacity, if I can say so. In other words, you've seen elites in both Nigeria and Angola, just to give you the two examples, improve their capacity to negotiate contracts, improve the technical capacity, certainly in the case of Angola, of Sonangol, the national oil company, which is extremely competent. Generally speaking, from a managerial perspective, their side of the bargain has been quite sophisticated, and yet this has not resulted in broad-based growth in any sort of developmental solutions for these countries. The reason why I'm concentrating in two countries in which elites have a great degree of sophistication is because neither in Nigeria nor in Angola would we deny the fact that you have thousands of sectoral professionals, a financial sector in both cases that is highly developed. Generally speaking, what we call capacity is not lacking in these societies. Rather, it's the political imperative to do something for the society that was lacking over the last decade. The reason why I think these experiences are relevant, therefore, is because there's been, I don't want to underplay the extent to which countries that are new to the oil and gas sector or to mining need to get clued up in technical terms, in managerial terms, that there's a huge knowledge gap between themselves and industry players. But to have a conversation that is mostly about capacity, that is mostly about technical solutions to the governance problems that Danny alluded to, would be very simplistic. And I find that it's precisely on this political end of the governance of natural resources spectrum that the conversation has not sufficiently resided in. And therefore, much of what I'll say next will emphasize, again, not to the detriment of the technical questions, the legal questions, the regulatory framework questions. These are all important dimensions. But I think that what empowered actors in resource-rich societies want to do with those resources, that's a question that defines everything else.
If I can quickly follow up on that before turning to the other great speakers. This is an incredibly important and potentially provocative statement that the main challenge or the challenge is not capacity. And particularly, it's no secret that that's what we hear very often from many official organizations, including the previous one where I was at the World Bank, but many others, official bodies, and from some governments in Africa itself. Our main problem is capacity. If it's not capacity, let's call it by its word, it's political will, unrelated to that. So we will need to address that and the implication of that. Yet at the same time, you said we should not belittle the technical issues. Well, but that does imply that there is then a major need for intervening and helping regarding capacity, or not?
Of course, and I'll just give you an example. In the taxi, Bob Conrad and I shared the same bad flight from Paris just a couple of hours ago. We were on the taxi. There's a lot of traffic, and Bob was just sharing some very bad experiences, some industry worst contracts that he'll have the opportunity to discuss with you later in the week. I'm thinking here, for instance, of the early mining contracts in Mozambique or the 1990s mining contracts in Ghana. And this is a serious example because Ghana is a state with a certain degree of stateness. It's not a failed state. It's a well-run place in many ways, and still its mining contracts are terrible, especially those signed in the 1990s. That's what I don't want to belittle. I think that there is certainly, we've seen that mostly in the mining sector, but also to some extent in the oil and gas sector, then when there's a huge discrepancy in capacity, in sophistication, in sectoral understanding between the government and the industry players, the result is terrible from the point of view of the fiscal intake of the state, and generally speaking, of the extent to which the country is likely to benefit. That's the part that I don't want to underestimate. Right. What I try to emphasize when I mention Nigeria and Angola is that these are countries that have 6 to 7 decades of experience in the oil and gas sector. Certainly in the case of Angola, in the case of Senegal, we all consider this to be a competent player, if not necessarily a developmental player. In Nigeria, perhaps more in the private sector and not necessarily in an NPC. There's tens of thousands of highly competent Nigerians with enviable sectoral experience, and yet things don't pan out.
So then the question becomes whether the reality may be quite different or similar in the new producers who do not have all these decades of experience. And we'll turn in a second to Charles and Prosper from that, because they represent both Kenya and Tanzania. Kenya and Tanzania alongside Mozambique and a few others have major or relatively major. In the case of Mozambique, is just vast amount of new discoveries, gas in particular, but in some cases oil as well. And with that comes an enormous challenge as well as an opportunity. So maybe we go to Charles first, and I know you have been giving a lot of thought to the issue of managing expectations, but if you can also comment in your introductory remarks as to more generally what you see as the major challenges in addition to managing expectations in the case of Kenya, and particularly on the issue, is it about capacity or is it about political will?
Yeah, thanks, Ricardo. I think Ricardo's intervention was just spot on. Because if you look at the Kenyan situation, for example, it's very easy to say, yes, there's a lack of legal framework. It's a legal framework, the lack of legal framework, so we're working on a legal framework on it. But at the same time, in 2010, we passed a constitution which gave provision, for example, for all natural resource agreements to go through parliament. That's not being implemented as we speak. In the same constitution, we have a provision on access to information, which would have improved transparency around the new fines. It's not being implemented either. We're talking about, we need enabling implementing legislation. So why don't we have it now? 4 years later, why don't we have this enabling legislation to put in context this good provisions of law? And it goes back, there's a lack of political will. And having said that, there's a lack of political will because I feel there's also a lack of understanding, a lack of appreciation of natural resources. Especially what natural resources mean, and especially in the context of the curse. Because what we see, especially when you go on the ground, natural resources are not the same as previous resources. So the politicians are seeing this as business as usual. But when you go on the ground, people feel ownership of these resources. So they're not going to allow these resources to just sort of be frittered away. So there's a lot, which has led to also a high expectation amongst the people where the fines are. So people are expecting transformation of their lives. A lot of the fines have been in areas where there's was previously underdeveloped. They had no services at all. So they're looking at this new fines and feeling this is what is going to transform their lives. But at the same time, when you come to the capital, where now that is supposed to translate into policy, into effective policy on how the revenues from that, we're not seeing that. When you're seeing about getting a good deal in terms of maximizing the benefits, we're not seeing that translating in the capitals. So there's a lack of that political will, and a lack of understanding of what these resources mean for those people on the ground.
And the main reason, let's be specific and concrete. The main reason for this notion of lack of political will is what kind of vested interest, inaction, corruption? What is it?
I think we keep leaving the wolves in the ship's pen and expecting different results. I think that's just sort of the easiest way to put it.
Okay, with that comment, we turn to, and we'll come back. But let's go to the neighbor, Tanzania,
yes,
with vast new reserves of gas in the cusp of beginning to develop it, including a whole framework that you're putting together. Prosper.
Yeah, I think the
Great name, by the way, Prosper.
Yeah, actually, my name's Honest Prosper.
Honest Prosper, right?
Now, so honestly speaking, then, I think among the greatest challenge, getting it correct this time around. We are talking about natural gas in Tanzania and maybe oil, as if these are the first natural resources that we are getting. For the past 50 years or so, Tanzania has been dancing with over 30 types of minerals: gold, diamond, tanzanite, you name it, not mentioning the Kilimanjaros, the Serengetis, and all this. And yet, we are yet to see the development that one would expect from a nation that has, that has kind of enjoyed all these natural resource endowment. So, having gone wrong for the past 50 years, really, I think the challenge is really getting it correct now. It's like now we're having the last bullet. We're having the last card. If it's football, it's Argentina having the last penalty against Brazil, just for example. So you miss it, then you miss it. So I think with this pressure, again, it's a huge challenge from how you manage the contract. How do you get the contracts correct? We had wrong contract, I believe, in the, in the hard minerals, in the gold and mine. We had bad negotiations from 1973 around. Like the fiscal regime has not been correct in Tanzania. We had a lot of, various types of taxes have not been in favor of the country. Like the royalties have been extremely low. But now around 2004, 2010, we have seen new regimes, new regimes in the extractive industry. But now these are new regimes that are coming, that came almost 30 years later. Now, to what extent now these new regimes that are relatively better are now being operated in minerals that still exist? With the technology that exists, if minerals have been extracted for the past 25, 20, almost 30 years, when you bring in new regimes, what is it that is left again? So I think the challenge now will be for natural gas. To what extent are we now going to get it correct? Even when we changed the old regimes to new regimes, contracts we are binding, and so some companies, most of investors said we are not ready to go to the new regime. So they remained in the older regimes. We are very lucrative to companies, but not the country. So the government has to kind of negotiate with new companies that do not have like a mineral sharing agreement, mineral development agreement from before. Again, now assuming that we get the revenues, and there's for natural gas, I think something that is going to come maybe 6, 7, 10 years to come. Again, using it correctly, it's a challenge. There are huge expectations, but then there have been huge promises. The politicians, as some of our colleagues have said here, we mainly think for the coming 5 periods that I'm going to be in office, so I'd like to spend as much as possible in my term, so to say. And this is a huge challenge, whether we are going to get expectations, we are going to get priorities correct, it's a problem. Whether we are going to spend in a way that will not kind of fuel inflation, it's a problem. Whether we'll be ready to spend it in a proper way, where we also think of the marginalized, the voiceless, and all kind of things. We are likely to use, you stop me now?
No, but these are lots of wonderful questions, but we want also an answer. Are you implicitly, let's be explicit, are you suggesting that it may make sense for Tanzania to slow down and to deliberately go slower in the rate of extraction and development and the use of resources because of the concerns that you have, and also perhaps as a way of ensuring that the future generations benefit more? Is that?
No. Not necessarily going slowly, but going correctly. And you may go fast and wrongly, but going fast but correctly is the way. And now, here comes now the role of learning from others, role of learning from those who have gotten it correct. We have Norway, for example, we have Trinidad and Tobago, and some other countries. But I've also said, and several times repeated, we also have to learn from those who have not gotten it correct, so that we don't fall on the same mistakes. We tend to take good practices, and sometimes we copy and paste, which is wrong. But I think we should also look at those who have not made it correct and avoid, those challenges, those mistakes.
If tomorrow you are the prime minister, and you look like the type of person who could be prime minister. It's hypothetical, but who knows, it may happen. If you are, and there is political space, talking about political will, political space in the relatively short term for one or two key initiatives and reforms, what would those be that you would promote?
Actually, it is the president who does those, not prime minister. So if I become the president, so I think the key issue will be, maybe contrary to my colleague, I think I will build capacity. Build capacity to be able to use those resources meaningfully. Well, I believe, yes, capacity is extremely important, but it's leaking. You know, this is one of those countries that are resource rich and capacity poor. So I will always focus on building capacity for the locals, of course, on how to use the resources and
And in addition to capacity, any reform, policy reform that you think the country would need?
Well, I believe we have gone through many policy reforms. From mid-1980s, this is a country that has undergone major and far-reaching reforms in the management of the economy. Remember, it's a country that had a socialist past. So I think the key issue again in Tanzania, as is the case for many other African countries, as Charles has said, well, it's not only reforms, but implementing the reforms. We have among the best laws, rules, policies, strategies, you name them, implementation. So if there was a policy called the policy of implementation, I would put one in place.
So now Charles has gotten promoted from prime minister to president of Kenya. Hypothetically, what would be your priorities?
I think my departure point would be, I mean, going back to what Prosper was saying, is I'd actually prefer if we stopped first. Let's stop first and say, what do we want from these resources? In Kenya, for example, we don't have a strong extractive sector background, right? So we've had a very good sort of mixed economy and things. So for me, it's, okay, how do we use these resources to springboard to where we want to go? For example, we have a Vision 2030, but it's not, you know, it's not sort of a completely accepted agenda in Kenya that this is where we want to go. So I'd say let's stop. If that's where we want to go, what procedures can we put in place to get us there?
Great. Ricardo.
I was just wanted to sort of make a rejoinder to Prosper's comments. Any country that starts a extractive industry sector anew will lack the expertise to manage that sector. So the capacity issue is non-negotiable. Of course, every new oil and gas producer needs to spend a lot of time creating the human resources that will allow that country to have a symmetrical, a balanced relationship with industry players. My point is rather that capacity has no moral status. It's what you make of it. And you can use capacity in pro-developmental ways, or you can use capacity to run a regime that is more that has a more limited set of concerns. And that's that extra political aspect that I wanted to highlight. Again, not to the detriment of capacity building in any way, shape, or form.
In fact, I mean, some of us are not known for having a comparative advantage in political correctness. So, since you mentioned football and Brazil and Argentina, I'm from Chile. So, if we're playing Argentina and Chile, we're usually losing. But only in football, because here there are two countries with such similar background in terms of colonial heritage, language, culture. In terms of capacity, if anything, there is higher education in Argentina and so on, yet we have gone completely different paths in terms of development. So there are some lessons in development which do point to the perhaps politically incorrect notion that just capacity is not it all. And there are other issues of leadership and governance and political will which are also important. Interesting enough, we are already like half an hour into this discussion and not the word transparency has been mentioned and openness, and this is where we're here. So where is transparency? Isn't that a major priority to start with, to address the issue of opacity, and shouldn't that then be a good conduit to alter the incentives regarding politics and political will and so on. Wouldn't that be a priority if you were in positions of leadership in any of these countries?
Well, clearly, a more transparent atmosphere shuts down avenues of discretion for whoever is important in the oil and gas sector. It prevents capital flight, it creates public knowledge about what's going on, but I think we all agree that it's not a silver bullet in any way. So from that perspective, we've spent a lot of time on the transparency issue over the last decade, efforts such as EITI, but perhaps to the detriment of other dimensions, and revenue management is one of those dimensions.
And what is the main concern? But this is a particular
With
angle.
EITI or?
Yeah, the particular angle are the global initiatives towards transparency. We should also be interested in the local country-based initiatives, but is there a particular concern about EITI or in general about global initiatives? Because also there are the mandatory listing requirements, newly adopted EU directives, which are being implemented already. In the US, it's under litigation by big oil and so on. Is that a general concern about those transparency initiatives, or is particular to one? The
situation on a country-specific basis for locally generating transparency initiatives is very, very, very different. In some of the countries where you have more thieving, to be blunt, there are also the countries where civil society organizations find it more difficult to mobilize. Then you have countries like Nigeria that in the last decade seem to have concocted a pseudo-reformist process which led absolutely nowhere, as we know. I'm thinking here of NEITI and its successor efforts. And then you have a lot of other variations. Let me just say about EITI. I think EITI, I was sort of well disposed towards it a decade ago when it started. Despite the fact that Publish What You Pay was already around, I thought NEITI was an effort that seemed to bring in stakeholders that would normally not be in the process of having a conversation on this subject. I have to say I'm very disappointed over the years. And this, despite the fact that when Peter Eigen left and Claire Short came in, Claire brought in a very different atmosphere. She was more sort of, she didn't seem to think that EITI was an effort that it had to prove itself in terms of a solution to problems rather than being a self-perpetuating organization. I think over the years, EITI, any organization, any effort that helps Azerbaijan improve its reputation is flawed in some ways. I can put flesh to this criticism, but there you go.
And this will continue tomorrow during this discussion, and we had a very lively discussion already on it. Maybe you want to comment and then Charles.
I agree what you're saying on IT, but then the problem that I've kind of seen in Tanzanian context, and I think some other countries, I understand we have to start from somewhere, and we have the minimum standards. You know, like in Tanzania, what is happening is now coming almost to the last node of the chain, of the long chain, comparing what companies have paid the government and what government has received. While indeed, if you draw the whole commodity value chain, really it's almost, I think, node number, maybe 6 or 7. If you have been if you have lost from, you know, the quantities that exist, the quantities that have been extracted, the quantities that have been sold, the profit that, you know, really coming to compare the revenues, I think, I understand there is a reason to that, but indeed does not, in my view, does not really give a true picture. You are coming to post-mortem that will never, you know, bring the dead body to life. Put it that way. But again...
So bring it to life. What would you do?
Well,
you're the president now. Yeah. What would you... Okay, so what would be your suggestion?
Well, of course, I understand. You know, one has to... But then if the process could start from really comparing the quantities that exist there, the commercial quantities that exist down on the ground, the quantities that have been really exploited, the quantities that have been sold, you know, all those kind of things. Along the whole chain, it would make more sense. And again, that we go back to capacity issues. But again, on the context of on transparency, I think it's beyond it, as he has said, it goes to contract. I think most of our countries are in a situation where most contracts are not really in the public space. Yeah, they are kind of confidential, a lot of confidentiality clauses where citizens, parliamentarians sometimes I'm not sure about my colleague, my friend, parliamentarian from Ghana, whether he knows what his government is signing with companies, you know, those kind of issues. We have situations where the minister has the discretion, for example, to make decisions on, you know, number of issues within the contract. So, you know, this disclosure in contracts, I think, is one of the problems too.
This is absolute music to some of our ears, and mine in particular. You know, with Guinea, we have this pioneering program thanks to the collaboration of the country of Guinea on resourcecontract.org. And because that was such an important missing element, including in the previous standards of EITI, now it's at least being encouraged. But this is crucial to get the data, not just on revenues, but to know what the deal was and get the contracts online. So already they're online and one can go there. Because Guinea has been a pioneer, other countries are beginning to come in. So we will talk about Tanzania and Kenya next. But let's go to Kenya on this point.
Yeah,
Charles.
Not to belabor what I've already said, but I mean, transparency is only just a part of the big link. I think there has to be openness from the beginning. So if you start with a very open process, there was open bidding, including even inclusion of the community. I think concepts like free, prior, informed consents of the community, I mean, these are key things to start off with, so that it's a very open process from the beginning with opportunity for input. When you come in at the stage where, like in the Kenyan stage now, where we're trying to put a legal framework in that removes the discretion from the ministers, so that we go through a very competitive process and the contracts are published. Now, you've sort of missed that place. So now we have the contracts already in place. We can't discuss them. There's the stabilization clauses, so we can't change anything.
You cannot.
Yeah. So there's already that section where we can't even engage at that. So, I mean, there might be a bit of transparency, also helped by international disclosure mechanisms. But, I mean, you're sort of caught there where you're just like, okay, it's good, I know. But I can't change anything significant.
Yeah, and those are clear challenges. But I guess we need to also keep in mind that while I think you're all making the argument that transparency is not sufficient,
It's essential.
but let's do agree that it's essential, A, and B, let's face it, we're not there yet. There's so much opacity still. It's not as if we have the data, and especially high-quality data, to be able to do the things that you're doing with contracts and then with revenues and change. Not to speak about another issue which is supposed to be very important in EITI, in the new standards, and that's the state-owned enterprises. A lot of more focus nowadays is on the private sector, multinational. That's really important, but sometimes we turn a blind eye to the national mining companies and the national oil companies where a lot is happening. I thought you were going to say, when you mentioned Nigeria, about the recent $20 billion missing funds and scandal that led to the resignation of Sanusi and the governor of the Central Bank was discussed this morning. And that maybe is a such way to open this discussion, because Ricardo, you mentioned the so-called pseudo reform process of Nigeria. So maybe you say something, what do you mean by that, and why pseudo? And then let's go to all the participants here, which are many, and I know many of you have such great experience and views. But
I'll be relatively brief. I think that about 12 years ago, when we started talking about the EITI, publish what you pay, generally speaking, the transparency agenda started to get mainstreamed. Some governments like Angola's, Equatorial Guinea's, were just adamant. They just didn't want to do this stuff. They were completely hostile to the reform agenda. Other shrewder governments, and in that regard, the Obasanjo administration was quite smart. They understood that this new trend had to be indulged somewhat, that you couldn't just go on like in the old days. The same way that corporations adopted corporate social responsibility as a sort of defensive mechanism mostly, most corporations, not all. Some governments decided to engage in a reformist process. And if that reformist process was itself a sort of reform-like process, in other words, it was a step-by-step, long-term, voluntary process that didn't actually ask governments to do that much, but in the meantime created opportunities for reputational enhancement, why not get on board? And I have to say that EITI allowed that for a long time, and it doesn't anymore, not to the extent that it did. It was not a very demanding effort. But let me concentrate on NEITI, the Nigerian case, rather than the international framework. NEITI, in the mid-2000s, you had people like the current and then finance minister, Ngozi Kajere-Yewala. You had Minister of Solid Minerals, Obi. All of these people seem to have access to the president. They seem to have a high-level mandate to change the sector. And Nigeria got a lot of good rep out of that process. In retrospect, I find that process to have been insincere. Not only was it a process manipulated by President Obasanjo, and when he no longer had the need for these technocrats, he let them go. But I question, especially in view of Finance Minister Ngozi's siding with President Goodluck Jonathan last week in her criticism of Sanusi, I question whether these technocrats are not lending themselves more or less self-consciously to being used politically by politicians who don't mean the reform effort, or at least they don't mean it all the way.
Well, we certainly have a debate here. So I think
That's what you asked for.
yeah, absolutely. So who wants to go first from the floor? And please, in each case, introduce yourself and where you come from, who you represent. Here.
I'm Samuel Momo from Sierra Leone. I work with the Ministry of Finance and Economic Development, specifically in the Revenue and Tax Policy Division. The issue of resource management over the period, it has been an outcry all over resource-rich developing country that we have not been getting it right. The correct atmosphere has not been created. That has been the cry all over. Now, I see that in Prosper presentation is somehow optimistic that they are going to get it right in Tanzania. Now, my question here is, I may benefit a lot from his response. What are the indications that you are going to get it right? Secondly, Ricardo and Charles has emphasized on political will as a very critical issue if we have to get it right. Are you optimistic that the current political atmosphere in Tanzania is not ripe enough for you to say that you're going to get it right? If that is the case, how different is the current political atmosphere to the previous one? In terms of capacity building, as a long time we have been crying over lack of capacity. When are we going to build up this capacity? You build capacity, and those who have been capacitated, they are not given the opportunity, and they go down into their graves with the capacity, living the capacity. Thank you.
Well, great questions. Let's go to Charles first.
On the building capacity question?
Well, no, I think.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, he also made the case about the importance of the politics, and therefore, are you optimistic? And then he will come back to honest Prosper.
In the Kenyan example, we have gone. I mean, since 2003, we have gone through significant reforms. I can't remember the exact number of regulatory bodies that we've set up. And the idea behind regulatory bodies was that we had this assumption that you get a regulatory body in who's not working on the same political cycle of 5 years, right? So that you get longer, policy that is more stable over the long term. Because just like the professor had mentioned earlier, of course, if you have politicians who have that 5-year cycle, and they're tied by that. So we had, in the Kenyan example also, between 2012 and 2013, just before the election, several contracts were signed for natural resources, just within that period. because people felt that they might not come back in. And so we are caught in that situation where that was a political decision which was made, 3, 4, 5 months before the election, but the country is tied in. The contract comes with the conditions which says that we can't even renegotiate those contracts. So I mean, it's a big challenge. So am I optimistic that we'll get it right this time? Having been intimately involved in the current development of the process, I must say I hold some reservations on whether it will be possible.
Thank you. Let me start a little bit on the capacity building. I think maybe the challenge is even greater than going to the grave with those capacities. It involves, again, getting good capacity in Norway and then, as a Tanzanian, and going to apply it in Qatar, going to apply it in Guinea, brain drain kind of a thing. So again, we may see a lot of capacity building within a country, and the capacity not staying within that particular country that was intended for. But then, with your free movement of labor, sometimes you may not, it turns to be called brain circulation rather than brain drain. Now, on whether we are going to get it now correct, well, I see some signs in a way, and you can read my face. I'm seeing some signs in that, at least with natural gas now and possibly oil, to some extent in Tanzania context, I think we are kind of discussing more than maybe we did for gold, for diamond and all this. The natural gas policy of Tanzania 2013 came October last year. At least there was almost a year of discussion on the draft policy. I'm not saying it's perfect, but at least there was some engagement in a way. And I think in terms of debate, maybe because in times of gold and diamond, how was it all this much matured? But I'm seeing more debates, more engagement, more questions on oil and gas. I'm seeing civil society coming up with issues, academia coming up with issues. I have a column that I write in the Citizen. I've written, I think, more than 10 articles, and I see the government somehow taking it positively. We debate lively in government television, a program called This Week in Perspective, where we come with critical issues, where nobody would expect that those issues will be discussed in the national media. So I think at least we are starting with a correct footing. Whether now we'll go in the correct direction, that's something else.
As economists tend to say, it's extremely hard to make predictions, especially when it's about the future. Right? Yeah. So the next question. Our friend. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm called Bernard Oponya from Uganda.
From Uganda.
Yes, I think I'd like to direct my concerns to Ricardo. You seem to not want so much lethargic about the capacity bit, but I think I want to get more from you in terms of that. In Uganda, the government is doing some work in terms of the capacity building. They are getting staff in the department in charge of oil and gas. That's PEPD. That's Department of Petroleum Exploration and Development Department. So there are a lot of staff who have gone to those countries, Norway, others, to learn about this sector. And I think they have some kind of arrangement where when you've been trained on government money, I think you are bonded for some time. So I wanted to get more from you in terms of, because like you said, the people may go to the grave with their capacity, and then Prosper talked about capacity circulation. The oil companies generally pay their staff much better than the government staff.
Yeah.
So what then should be the interplay between that capacity which government has built so that you have it within government instead of training and then they go out, they keep on going out? Yeah, what are the best scenarios? What should be done?
Thank you for, these were excellent questions all. Let me just say I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic about whether African countries in particular are able to meet these challenges. I think it's a very country-specific situation. What I would rather underline is the sense of urgency about these challenges, because governments don't reform while undergoing a resource boom. A resource boom consolidates the status quo. It makes the regime more powerful, less willing to have a reciprocal relationship with civil society. So the years now, the years between the present and whenever these resources come on stream in a major way, say 3, 4, 5 years from now, 6 years from now in the case of Mozambique, those are the crucial years. And the institutional capacity and the legal structure that you lock in before, that's what's going to define the life of that sector for a generation or more. So my take is not at all pessimistic, but it's a sort of it's a challenge. In a very really short amount of time, things are going to have to happen, both in intangible ways as to the quality of the politics of some of these states, but also in terms of the formal apparatus. For instance, the role of parliament in many of these countries is junior. These are very, very, very presidentialist systems in which the president doesn't abuse power. He can literally constitutionally do whatever he wants. It's always a he in the countries we're referring to, except for Liberia, perhaps. So from that perspective, there's formal work to be done in order to consolidate a degree of oversight, which parliaments are just mostly not able. Kenya is partly an exception under the 2010 constitution. To answer your question specifically on Uganda, Uganda is an interesting case because Uganda has been a donor-dependent country, very similar to Mozambique in that regard. Since the late 80s, a great deal of the country's budget has come from donors as direct budget support. So for many years, in the case of Mozambique even more so, in the case of President Museveni has always been a special one. But for many years, the government of Uganda has known how to play to donor agendas, at least in some areas that kept the donors happy with the government, in order to then renege on donor agendas in other corners of the system. Democratization is one of them. Ever since he started to feel the smell of oil money, he started to really backtrack, I would say renege on many of his prior commitments. Same thing happening in Maputo over the last year and a half, 2 years. So from that perspective, what you see in President Museveni is both a sort of technocratic desire to build state capacity in the oil sector. He doesn't want Uganda to be fleeced. He doesn't want his people to be fleeced by the oil companies, as he thinks they have 3, 4, 5 years ago. On the other hand, the extent to which that is being put at the service of a national development agenda is questionable. Certainly what you see from a political perspective is a concentration of decision-making in the oil sector in the president's palace. Not in the ministries, not in the public institutions. What you actually see in some regards is a deinstitutionalization of decision-making and a concentration of discretionary power in his presence. This is a perfect example of capacity building and political concentration happening simultaneously, because he's an old fox and he wants it both ways.
Actually, he calls it my oil, you know.
There you go.
Ugandans will know this.
But just a point, just very briefly on Mozambique. I'm doing extractive industries country strategy for Oxfam in Mozambique, and I've been going there. I'm going there tomorrow. That's why my teaching is going to be relatively brief tomorrow. And Mozambique just throws up all sorts of questions about how reform-minded the government is. A government that over the last 25 years has signed up to pretty much every single donor agenda that you can think of. Over the last year and a half, they're still 40% dependent on donor money for their budget, and yet they're starting to feel a certain degree of leeway, and they're starting to distance themselves from things that many Western donors thought had been fully assimilated, that they were no longer donor impositions, that the government liked these agendas. It turns out the government never liked them. And now that it finds that it has the space to backtrack, it is doing so.
Next. You and then yourself.
Hi, my name is Nico. I'm from Germany and I study here at the Environmental Sciences Department. And
just Nico.
Nico Wojtynia, sorry.
Just Nico.
And my question is whether the state of the environment should be a concern for decision makers and policy makers in the case of Africa. I mean, clearly the countries concerned are in dire need of revenues, etc. But is it an imperative to also preserve, the state of nature as it is? Prosper, you mentioned Kilimanjaro and Serengeti. Surely those shouldn't, or similar situations shouldn't arise. For example, in Malawi, you have some developments of gas resources being found under the lake. That might mean some serious implications for the tourism sector. So, what's your view on this? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, of course, the state of environment should be an issue, but now whether it has been an issue, that's something else. We have seen, for example, one of my colleagues said this morning, in Tanzania, we have just discovered the uranium at the mid of Selo national game, and this is in the Now the question is whether should we take up all the uranium and let all the rare wild animals go away? So I think this is a huge debate, and I think somehow we are likely, the friends of the environment, the lovers of flora and fauna, are likely to lose in favor of uranium. In gold mining areas, we have seen a number of cases where there have been a lot of waste going from mineral activities going to rivers. We had the river Tigete and some other rivers where those have been the issues. Now, when it comes to oil and gas, specifically natural gas, I think those are part of issues you read, at least in the policy. At least they are being underlined. We have the National Environmental Management Council with all the rules and regulations. As I've said, it may be a lion, but whether it has teeth and whether those teeth can bite, that's something else. So rules, regulations, institutions for environment management are in place. Now, whether they are really doing what they're supposed to do, whether they have the power, really, this is one of the concerns. Maybe later we have somebody who deals with the environment at the WWF. If you give him a chance later, maybe, or even now, he may give the situation on the ground.
We will go first to you, and then once we go to that side of the table, we'll come back to the environment.
My name is Bigaim Sankulova, and I'm a modular doctoral student from the Legal Studies Department, and I come from Kyrgyz Republic. I have two questions, if I may. The first question is related to the statements on good models or like best practices. Well, a number of natural resource-rich countries definitely face a lot of challenges in trying to turn the increased revenue flow into the sustainable development of the respective countries. So I wonder, are there any good models, maybe countries or specific mining projects that would be good for the mining or oil and gas sector of East Africa? That's the first question. And then the second question would be related to the involvement of the communities. Some of the speakers emphasized the importance of being open, of making sure that the community is involved. So I wonder, do you have any impact and benefit agreements in East Africa, like the ones in Canada, that, for example, Canadian mining companies sign with Aboriginal communities? Thank you.
Should we start with Ricardo? You want to?
I think these questions are
okay
more for
Charles.
I was
Charles,
say, there's no wholesale model that East African countries should sort of adopt. There's experiences, there's very positive experiences elsewhere. I'm skeptical about the best practice of Norway being sort of fitting like a glove with experiences in places like Chad, if you will, simply because the institutional context is so different for all sorts of reasons, obviously enough. But I think that there's many countries in the quote-unquote developing world that have had far more positive experiences. Certainly in West Africa, Ghana's not playing out like Nigeria thus far. It has a lot to explain to its neighbors. Botswana, obviously, in the mining sector is very specific experience. But there are, even in Africa itself, experiences that are much more positive than some of the end of the spectrum experiences that I focused on in Nigeria and Angola. That said, those bad experiences are more frequent. So.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, we in Kenya, I mean, we are looking at all other jurisdictions. I think Ghana has been sort of what we've been looking to because they seem to be, sort of closer to what Kenya is. But again, the Kenyan context has to come in terms of what would be agreeable, for example, that will actually go through Parliament, for example. And that's what we're finding, that a lot of the policies that are already in place in Ghana are being shut down as we speak. In terms of impact and benefit.
What is being shut down exactly?
Provisions, for example, one, like I mentioned before, the provision around Parliament. That is what is one of the biggest contentions now. The Constitution speaks about Parliament enacting legislation that will talk of the transactions that would have to get parliamentary ratification. So of course, at the moment, the technocrats are preferring a model where parliament has a very low say in most of the contracts. So I mean, that's a sort of one example. While in Ghana, that you have a model which, you know, proper ratification by parliament, but also has a public interest and accountability committee, which has its own challenges, but it's still there. You know, it's a provision that's already there. So that's something at the moment which doesn't seem to be on the table in Kenya. In terms of impact and benefit, and it goes to the question before of just Nico, the environmental and impact social assessments, they're ongoing at the moment. Some of the oil companies are undertaking a big project. But what we find is because of the low regulatory, the very low regulatory capacity, they are not followed and implemented effectively. So at the moment, some of the oil companies are implementing a very effective sort of community engagement, but that is due to problems that they've had. So they've experienced problems with the community, and now they are appreciating the importance of engaging the community. So it's also not a standardized thing across the board. So it's basically a case-by-case basis. So if the company is in an area where the community is not hostile, they sort of just go in and do what they want. But when there's hostility, then they implement processes.
Talking of environmental impact assessment, I understand. It has been a problem, I think, in some contexts, even Tanzania context, where some of these environmental impact assessments have been funded by the companies themselves. So you find huge conflict of interest. You know, I'm funded by you. It's exactly like some researchers funded by the pharmaceuticals, you know, those kind of issues. So you really find issues within that. So the question is not only ticking the boxes that environmental impact assessment has been done, but who did it? How transparent was it? How objective was it? So we have bigger problems that we are thinking.
I think in the Kenyan example, there's actually an environmental impact assessment which says there's no impact. I mean, it's an offshore installation, and they're saying there's no impact. There'll be no impact on marine life. So I mean, you can just sort of see in terms of illustration.
Yeah,
It cost a lot to get to that.
just wait. Let's move on to this topic that was only briefly mentioned, because in particular, if we hear Ricardo's a very sobering political economy reality and assessment that you have, the role of state, national oil and gas companies, and also national mining companies, how can they then become part of the solution within your analysis and framework, which makes it sound that it will be part of the very same capture by the political leadership and uses away from improving governance? Or is there a way of transforming many of these national companies into a positive force, like in some cases, like in my own country, the national mining company is extremely efficient. It's not without some issues which are raised, at least raised, and there's an improvement. But what's your view on the national companies and their future? And then I want to go to Charles and Honest Prosper.
Well, historically, we need to accept the fact that in places, the old PDVSA, Pemex in Mexico, Aramco in Saudi Arabia, these companies were very important players, especially in the 1970s, in diminishing the asymmetry between foreign corporations and local and the local state, and in some cases replacing foreign investors wholesale. So I think historically they've played not always a negative role, but and that I think is a very important place. And certainly in the case again that I mentioned earlier in Angola, Sonangol, which is probably the second largest company in Africa after Algeria, Sonatrach. It's really in many ways an admirable enclave of excellence with a lot of technical personnel and the capacity to create a certain symmetry between Angola and the foreign oil investors. The problem is what political ends they serve through that capacity. And we know that in the case of Saudi Aramco is the personal instrument of the monarchy. In the case of Angola, President dos Santos defines what Sonangol does for good and ill. So the question really is about national oil companies. They're neither intrinsically good nor bad, but they're a function of what the regime is trying to do more generally. So we go back to the ultimate political question. Do the rulers of resource-rich states have a developmental agenda for their countries, They certainly, in the case of Nigeria or Angola and some of the East African countries that are now going to see a windfall, a completely different order of magnitude of what they've had available in the post-colonial period, they have a real opportunity to make a difference. They will no longer be traditional sort of cash-poor African states. They will be able to make choices. The question is what choices they want to make. So in that sense, I think national oil companies, they can be enclaves of excellence and competence if the state has the intention to put these resources to good use, or they actually can maximize what I called earlier, the felonious capacity of states if these states are not, if you will, the incumbents are not serious about national development. So rather neutral view of national oil companies.
But, well, neutral but very diplomatically careful, because before you were suggesting that many of these...
You want me to be more provocative? I can be.
Sure, why not? The logical conclusion of what you were saying before, which is that many of these rulers and leadership do not have necessarily the public interest in mind, then the implication of that is that one would have to be very, very skeptical in those countries, at least, perhaps differently than Ghana or Botswana or others, but maybe those, I don't know if you're implying those are more the exception than the rule, and therefore in some sense you're passing implicit judgment on...
I think the public-spirited leaders are in the minority in the countries that we're dealing with here.
Charles?
Yeah, I think national oil companies can play a critical role, especially around the discussion earlier around capacity. We're talking about capacity. So at the moment, even Kenya is building capacity. So we have people in universities learning about oil law. We're training oil engineers. But and this goes back to what I was saying before, but what is our vision long term? If we had a vision long term, for example, that these Kenyan resources, what we'd like is to build up a national oil company that's going to be able to sufficiently extract these resources, and we can get maximum benefits as a country, for example. So a national oil company would fit, perfectly in such a scenario. But at the moment, we're sort of left to almost the whims that, we get lucky. So at the moment, we do have some critical reformists in the national oil company, but who are, of course, constrained in the political context that they have, and they're getting fought as they try to bring, sort of positive reforms.
And the constraints would come from where?
Well, okay, for example, our national oil company, the CEO is almost a competitive process where, you go through interviews. But at the same time, the board is politically appointed with no sort of criteria. So basically, the board serves the interest of who has appointed them, and in that sense, they have say in how the CEO is run and how the CEO runs a company and where they fall out. There's pressure that can be placed in the right places.
Well, that's related to potential capture, let's call it.
If I may just put it, the issue of capacity goes even further. For instance, several of the more sophisticated actors in the national oil company segment, I'm thinking here in Africa, for instance, Sonatrach and Sonangol, but also to some extent NNPC in Nigeria, they've been adept for many, many years to bring the big four, the big consultancies, to plug whatever holes they have. When they don't have, for instance, capacity to audit oil companies, they'll bring in KPMG to do so. And these companies, as service providers, are there to enact the agendas of whoever is paying for them. So we have global corporations, for instance, the case of Angola, I just finished a book on Angola. The Cambridge, Massachusetts, sort of very reputable consulting firm, Arthur D. Little, managed the national oil company of Angola during the communist period from the mid-70s until the early 90s. In other words, capacity, it's again the same point, it's what you make of it. And sometimes when we think that we're sort of building capacity, we're certainly building capacity, but not necessarily the sort of capacity we would like to see.
Well, there's the famous case of another consulting company and academics from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and also from London that were advising Gaddafi.
Oh, yeah.
And got $10 million or more from that, and that created a major reputational scandal once everything was uncovered, which leads to the issue of having also full transparency and disclosure in terms of, in the academic world, in terms of conflicts of interest. When you write op-eds and when you write pieces, are you writing objectively or are you being paid by somebody? So the issue of opacity and transparency applies across the board and across the world. Let's go to you on the national oil and gas companies.
Yeah. In Tanzanian context, maybe I'll talk about a company, Tanzania, TPDC, Tanzania Petroleum Development Corporation, which is, you know, part of the issues are this is both the player and the referee. You know, it is the regulator, yet it is also an investor in the sector, and it has a lot of now issues to do with the conflict of interest. But then, the way it is, this is a company really, it's just a state company for sure. But then, we really doubt whether it has, you know, the vibrancy, the dynamics that a true private sector mentality that is needed in this sector, you know, whether it has the capacities. You know, whether to be able, for example, because if to really run this as a professional company, modern company, at times you need to raise capital in the stock exchange. It's New York, Washington, or whatever. Now, whether this company can do it, it's really a problem. But also, this is a company where for 1 or 2 decades, it froze employment. It was not employing people. So we have people who are on the 11th hour of the day, people who are going to retire anytime soon. So we have issues with, you know, institutional memory and all kind of things. So that being said, it's really an issue whether, as a company, maybe to be just taking a box that we have a national oil company, and whether it will really be able to be as vibrant as the Statoils of the world, the Petrobras of the world. This is really an issue.
Well, you're saying it's a question, so you're being skeptical. And you would prefer a different approach with more private sector involvement, including in Tanzania? What?
For sure. I would also like, yes, within the TPDC, the company that exists, capacity. There is a need really to build the capacity of this company, but also I would like to see more private sector involvement, you know, more vibrant private sector involvement.
Capacity and politics, we keep going back and forth. I know there was a question, you were raising your hands, very important perspective.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Lemayon Melioki from Tanzania. And my question is directed to Honest Ngoyi, and I hope he will speak about this honestly. And the question is...
Speak up, please.
Yes. The question I have is that one of the problems that made Tanzania as a country lose in the extractive industry, particularly the mining sector, is corruption. Corruption has been one of the problems, and grand corruption for that matter. And as we speak, corruption is still a problem in Tanzania, even now. So that makes me wonder why Honest is so optimistic about the future, given that more massive resources have not been discovered and corruption is still there, which was the major problem during the signing of contracts in the past. So this is a question I would like him to try and shed some light on. And the other question I have is with respect to the NOC, the National Oil Company. Well, this company actually is, the way it is right now, is not a typical oil company that is discussed in the literature, for example, about Senegal, this company in Angola, in Nigeria, or so on. This is more like a small department of government that has been, for some reason, government decided to call it National Oil Company or Tanzania Petroleum Development Company. But actually, the way it operates is very much similar to the way government operates. So there is no independence between the company and the ministry. And until very few days ago, before I came here, I had some discussions there. And the CEO was spending much of his time in the ministry's offices waiting to meet the, I don't know, some junior officers in the ministry. You know, so the independence isn't there. And to call it a national oil company, maybe where it's not really an oil.
So what is the question?
My question in this respect
Right.
is that Tanzania does not really, my point actually, does not really have an oil company in the way it is presented in the literature. However, I know that there is a major reform and coming up, and this has been in the government books for more than 2 years now. But the discussion about the reform is not there, and I would like Goe, based on his experience on this issue, to shed some light as to what direction should the reform then go in order to get to have a national company that can really operate in the way that these other companies have operated, in the light of corruption, of course, which is a bigger problem.
Quick answer.
Yeah, of course, I agree exactly on what you're saying about corruption, and it is corruption in contract, corruption in the procurement and all this. As now the question was, why am I being optimistic that this time around we'll make it, although there is so much corruption? If you could see I was hesitating. What I was saying is, it seems that we have started on the right footing, but now whether we'll go north or south, that's something else. Yeah. So I think, by the fact that we are discussing all these kind of issues, to some extent, it's a good beginning that we are trying to see that corruption is one of those problems, could be one of those binding constraints that will make us not make it. I think it's a starting. And of course, as you know, we have a problem in Tanzania. We deal mainly with a petty corruption rather than a major corruption, you know. We deal with someone who has bribed someone an egg and leave those who have taken billions. So I think at least those are issues that are coming to the fore. Now, as to what kind of company this TPDC should be, I agree with you that actually what we are having is kind of one of the departments in the Ministry of Energy and Minerals, TPDC, you know. If they make money, you never know whether they'll be asked to finance next election, you know, those kind of things. So I would wish really to see more a vibrant, totally free national oil company. And now I wonder whether it's a must to have a national oil company. I once discussed the question of having, for example, Tanzania. You have Air Tanzania. You know, it's a flag carrier, and it's not carrying any flag. It's a company that has 200 people and one flag and one plane. So if you're having companies that are not really companies, better disband them.
Okay. Well, now you're talking. Would that apply in the oil and gas sector?
I mean, the issue, of course, will be to reform the TPDC so that it becomes really a global company that we want to see. Okay. Totally free, totally independent, totally vibrant, and a dynamic, playing to the rules of the game. Now, the question is, unfortunately, there are more questions. Will the politicians kiss TPDC goodbye and let it go? And I think the answer is no, unfortunately.
Ricardo.
I just wanted to introduce myself during this conversation. There was a brief foray into EITI, but we mostly discussed this as happening at the domestic level and what politicians do and what institutions do. But this is playing out in a global canvas. And we make sometimes the default assumption that the global atmosphere is reformist and it's the internal politics that are crooked. But I just wanted to bring to the table the issue of capital flight. For instance, the difficulties that we've had in the past 2 weeks for the UK government to have a robust attitude towards Russia because it's so dependent on Russian capital flight. And clearly from countries like Nigeria and Angola and Gabon, and we all know the stories, they're all true. These economies hemorrhage resources on a daily basis that are of a monumental scale. And it's not just to the Western financial systems. It's now to Dubai, to Singapore, to Hong Kong, and many other up-and-coming sort of unregulated financial centers. Just bringing these issues back in also shows that even when you have civic-minded reformist politicians who want to do the right thing, you know, the international system has to help them do the right thing.
So let me follow up on this, and we're on the home stretch. So very brief, because I want to have the last quick 2 rounds on two questions. One, since you brought this up, Ricardo, and we have not discussed enough, international NGOs, civil society, You are now working with Oxfam, about to go to Mozambique. What would be your main proposal to do something about it that as a global initiative could help and make a difference on this? You're skeptical about the ITI. What instead, where would you put your investment, your eggs and that? They are international NGOs, civil society, Oxfam, the coalitions, publish what you pay. What should be the focus next? And then to Charles and Honest Prosper, I want to ask the same question, but domestically. In Kenya and in Tanzania, is civil society doing enough to address these constraints? And if not, why not? And what could and should be done more?
The domestic politics are crucial, and there's no replacing civil society, people mobilizing for their rights. Nothing's going to be given to them for free. They're going to fight for it. But you asked me about the international dimension. I've, over the years, lost my patience with the voluntary efforts simply because they permit so much free riding. They permit so much double talk. So I think that Dodd-Frank, what's happening in Canada, what's happening in the EU, is the very least that we in the developed world can do. And I'm very supportive. I'm very disappointed with the API's lawsuit against the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I hope that we can fight back in that regard. More generally, and without sort of ending on an overly pessimistic note, when there's a resource boom, this tends to tip the already very asymmetrical relationship between the state and society very much in favor of the state, in favor of the regime, because it gives regimes a lot of money and a lot of aloofness from social pressures. So what's going to happen in many civil societies, not in Ghana and in other democratic places where there's a vibrant public sphere, good media, but in many other places, in places like Uganda and Mozambique, the space for civil society is going to decrease. The government is going to have towards civil society, including civil society organizations that present themselves in a constructive way, the governments are going to have a more adversarial attitude towards them. They're going to do a Putin. They're going to say that they're instruments of foreign imperialism, etc. And the space for them is going to decrease. Another issue that was raised earlier, the issue of brain drain. A lot of people, civil society organizations, are going to lose some people who are going to go and work for the corporate sector. In states that are traditionally donor-dependent and quote-unquote poor, you either work for civil society or international organizations or you're a lowly paid civil servant. A third option is going to appear, which is employment in the foreign private sector. And my experience is that people are going to move. So civil society is going to get also a little sort of brain drain happening within its ranks. So these issues are issues that international partners should be sensitized towards and should play a proactive role addressing and not just wishing these dynamics away. They're going to play out. We need to be ready for them.
Well, I hope if we meet in a year or two as a panel again, we're not all working for Shell. Or something like that.
Well, there is more money in Shell.
Well, and
I've got tenure, so.
Oh, you got tenure, so you're fine. But Ricardo speaks even faster than some of us, so it may not have been totally clear that he said the lawsuit by API against the Security and Exchange Commission. API is the American Petroleum Institute, which is the lobbying arm of big oil, which is really fighting against disclosure, mandatory disclosure and transparency in the U.S. But that's still ongoing, and we hope that that's eventually going to go through. In the meantime, the European Union has leapfrog ahead of the U.S.
Very important.
And that's extremely important. It's beginning to be implemented already, UK and other places, and Canada is making progress. So this is a big movement of food, and we should recognize that. So. Charles?
Yeah, I think firstly, civil society has to leverage on those international disclosures that you're talking about to first gain that information and then be able to synthesize this information into accessible data that people can use for the communities. I mean, that's sort of the first thing. But then civil society has to keep to its traditional role as well in terms of pushing for transparency. It has to keep pushing the political class to ensure that we talk of political will, but we have to create, it has to be demand-driven so that the communities are also demanding their rights, and that forces the political class to move. And I guess one of the important things as well is just sort of amplifying community voices in terms of getting them, organizing them to be able to articulate the issues that really are close to them. The communities can also be used sort of politically, and we've seen that happen, across the continent. So it's important that we identify the issues that are sort of key for the community, that are sort of a departure point for them to come up with. And I guess lastly, just sort of echo Ricardo's point, but we also have to realize that civil society, the space is shrinking drastically. In the last year, there was legislation in Kenya, for example, which sought to close the space for civil society, so that that civil society will not be able to function. So I think we have to understand that context as well.
And this is an incredibly important statement, because if that's happening in countries like Kenya, which we all know that has had many achievements and challenges, but at least the opening of civil society and the movement towards more voice and accountability since the Arab Moi era was recognized very widely. But in recent times, if you are suggesting that this is going in a different direction, and in fact we hear that from a number of countries, that is an extremely worrisome trend. What about Tanzania?
Well, broadly speaking, I think civil society organizations have been trying their level best, but of course, there is always a room for improvement. There is more that could be done. For example, we have a civil society organization, kind of an umbrella called the Police Forum. We meet, I think, every last Friday of every month at British Council, discuss a number of issues. Now, one of the issues that we have discussed, they are kind of tapping revenues from oil and natural gas taps, where, we are discussing those issues. Norwegian Church here, the UNHCR, has commissioned a study with the $1 billion question that I was part of the authors, kind of showing exactly where the country has been losing money in a number of sectors, including in the extractives. I understand some are trying to engage communities in Lindi and Twara, where oil and gas is going to take place. But of course, maybe I'm biased because I'm coming from the capacity building industry. I am also a member of the Foundation for Civil Society, and we see really some of the local civil society organizations, the NGOs, really they have relatively small capacity when it comes to really urging these issues. We are likely to see some of them, again to add to the point that Ricardo said, we're likely to see members, staff from local civil society organizations moving to international civil society organizations, people moving from a certain organization to Oxfam, to ActionAid, etc., and they may be shifted to Cambodia, to US, to Canada. So the problem is bigger than just moving from NGO to the private sector, but also moving from local to international and NGOs, and they can be transferred now to anywhere across the globe.
That's great. That's an interesting notion, the capacity building industry. We need to elaborate afterwards or what that means. The time has come to virtually conclude, but I don't want that to happen without maximum 1 minute each of you on this angle, to end at least with a positive note, because this was, there were some positives, but there were also lots of challenges. What in the countries that you work and that you know gives you hope in terms of a particular concrete initiatives or something that has happened soon that you can say, yes, it can be done, even if it's a niche, even if it doesn't yet apply to the whole country. So to end on that type of note, we can always find, and we see it in the data when it's so important, we feel, to look at the data, to get the data, open data. Once we find that every country, even with the most important challenges, we find that there are niches which show organizations, a few reforms that show, yes, when there is a will, there is a way. So maybe we start with you, and then with you, Honest Prosper, then Charles, and we finish with Ricardo. And Ricardo will force you to say something positive.
So I can say something negative? No, I think on the positive note, I think one of the great things that are happening in Tanzania, and maybe David should be happy, is the natural resource charter in Tanzania. Right. Its formation and its composition. We are having, the panel of experts, and there is natural resource charter research team, which I'm a team. My friend Melioki is a team, and some two other colleagues. And part of our role are to kind of kind of really discuss those issues, advise the panel of experts, and at the end of the day, advise the government. And I think we are totally free and independent. You find something black and white, you say this is black and white. You don't say it's colored. Whether the president will be happy or not, we speak our voices. And I think this is good.
Right. Charles?
I think one positive thing, especially around the natural resources, is that Kenyans are increasingly accused of being apathetic. There's sort of apathy. So even with corruption, people just say, "Oh." But what we are feeling, and especially on the ground, is people are feeling ownership of these resources. When you go to these communities, people are saying, this is our oil, which for me, coming from an anti-corruption background, is very positive. That people are actually feeling that they have ownership. And this should, in turn, translate into sort of better policy because it will be a lot more demand-driven.
So there has been a reawakening and an anti-apathy movement, which is great. And not to be misunderstood, Ricardo, you have said something. A lot of constructive things, but very also
so can
frank,
I be really
frank and you've been also very frank and sobering
Yeah.
about many of these countries, but maybe also other countries, so you don't have to necessarily mention the same ones that you mentioned before.
I would highlight two very positive dynamics. One is I think there is more and more a convergence between local civil society initiatives and these grander sort of international regulatory efforts. You feel that not only local societies, civil societies are becoming more professionalized, but that their efforts and the efforts in the international system are becoming more mutually enforcing, which wasn't always the case. For a long time, it felt like things were going on all sorts of directions. I think that is the most important positive
Where
result.
have you seen that?
All over the place. For instance, the fact that in Nigeria, in Mozambique, in Uganda, and I'm thinking here of countries by bringing in Mozambique, a very different level of local capacity than Kenya or Nigeria. What's happening with Dodd-Frank or with the European Union is registering at the ground level. And people are using this as talking points in addressing their governments. And they're doing their research and their analysis with these issues in mind. This wasn't happening 7 or 8 years ago. It happened with Global Witness, some of the earlier reports, but this is now being done at a very, very consistent level. And you don't find this disconnect that was so common a decade ago. So that's for me the most interesting sort of general dynamic that I welcome. At the broader sort of level, I would say that especially the young in many African countries, I disagree with this idea that Kenyans are becoming apathetic. I think that, say, 20 years ago or 10 years ago even, people knew nothing about their extractive industries, and there was a certain sense that this was a reserved domain for the presidency, for the powerful. Now people have much more of a sense, sometimes a very frustrated sense of what's being subtracted from them. But I find that there's much more of an urge to find out and much more of an urge to bring the question of extractive industries into the mainstream of politics. In other words, in electoral politics, this is showing up. This was a non-issue. 10 years ago, people, when there were electoral campaigning, people would talk about all sorts of issues, but these would not be core issues, not even in Nigeria. Now, rarely a local election goes by in Nigeria without some sort of oil matter being central to everyone. Both the incumbents have to defend themselves and the challengers bring this up. I find that an extraordinarily positive dynamic, this awakening to people's rights.
And that awakening is also related, don't you think, to the power of information and data and disseminating the know-how. The 50 of us who are not only here now for this public panel, but also for the two-week course, have a particular responsibility, and we are here for that, and eventually to help and disseminate and get to the population as a whole. And that there has been a revolution, including with IT and so on, in disseminating these tools, this data, this information, which was totally opaque in the past. We're not fully there yet, but I think we all have. This is a great ending statement by you, Ricardo, by Charles, by us, Prosper, but it also implies a responsibility for us all. Let me thank this great panel we have. Great participation from you. Thank you very much.